I am the co-founder of a global maternal health organization called CCI, which stands for Communities for Childbirth International. I am also a student pursuing a bachelor's degree in neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania in the United States. Today, my presentation is going to be consisting of two main pillars. One is going to be changing our mindset on how we work with these religious leaders. The second part is going to be how we can establish a better feedback loop, which can give us some guidance on how we can better collaborate to get better evaluations, better interventions, and thus better sustainability and results. So first, starting off with changing our mindset and redefining the framework, I would like to first propose that there is a great need to redefine the role of religious leaders in promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights. So far, I've witnessed many stories, read a lot of articles where interventions were utilizing religious leaders as trainers or mere mentors within their religious organizations. We also hear so many stories about how religious leaders have so much power in their words at the tip of their lips and so on, especially on the vulnerable youth of this country that make up 30% to 50% of the entire population. Well, this time I want us to flip the coin, and maybe think about what these religious leaders would mean to the youth who need help anything regarding sexual and reproductive health. In other words, I want us to think about who else these youth would have if they want to reach out to anyone if they had issues regarding SRH. So the question again today is, who else do they have? Let's start with schools. The dropout rate in Uganda is really high, ranging from 50 to 60%, higher for girls, higher for those living in rural areas. And ironically, or not ironically, literature says that 25% to 34% of these dropouts from girls are due to teenage pregnancy. So it's crazy high. And also to add on, teachers and the ratio of teacher to student is one of the world's highest here in Uganda. So for way too many adolescents who are either not in school or who are in school or who cannot find a good mentor figure, it's so hard for them to find a person to consult topics, sensitive topics like sexual and reproductive health that require a lot of trust, a lot of respect for that person that they're trying to get some consultations from. So how about in the families? How about in the household? Do they have a more comfortable environment in the families to talk about these topics in SRH? There are a lot of studies actually that show that both girls and boys, but especially boys, almost never talk about sex education, dating, relationships, STIs, and other things in SRH with their families. And even for those who have even the slightest experience talking about with their families, the most common triggers of these discussions were from the parents' side. So it wasn't initiated by the students and the youth themselves. It was always the parents who became suspicious about the boy coming home late or coming home later than usual, having a lot of female friends recently, and that pretty much initiated that suspicion, initiated the conversation. So it was definitely a conversation of a lot of discomfort, definitely not an easy voluntary environment for these girls and boys, young youth, to ask and consult about their most largest frustrations or questions about sexual and reproductive health and rights. And I think this is absolutely the major reason why such a large proportion of these youth are getting their information about sexual and reproductive health and rights from their peers or mass media, which is so easy to propagate inaccurate myth and inaccurate information. So then again, trickling back to the main question of the day, who else? Who else, if not from families, if not from schools, can be their next prominent, powerful, strong, and trustable mentor figures that can guide these adolescents on their health and well-being, healthy decisions, and responsible actions. It definitely has to be someone they can trust with their full hearts, someone that they respect for their entire lives, and someone who they can believe to be having the most wisdom and guidance in life. So who else do they have? And if anyone asked me that question, if anyone, instead of me asking you, if anyone asked me that question, I would personally look nowhere other than religious leaders themselves. If anyone can teach these young people to be brave enough to ask these sensitive and personal questions, guide them on accurate societal values and virtues, and sometimes teach them how to reach out for help at the right timing. I can't really think of any other reliable, incredible, and socially respected adult figure as competent and powerful as our religious leaders themselves. So tying that back to what that means for us, we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean for us as community stakeholders, nonprofit organizations, academic institutions, and what does that mean for us in creating an environment where religious leaders can really open up their full potential to address what they can in the field of sexual and reproductive health? I think we should all start by stop limiting the role of religious leaders as simple mentors or trainers in just spreading the knowledge in sexual and reproductive health, which is the main way these nonprofit organizations or interventions are trying to utilize them as a resource. I think it's time that we redefine the role of these religious leaders and organizations to be the youth's safety net and point of contact when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights issues. I really think these religious leaders can go above and beyond to make the youth feel really knowledgeable and also confident about so many different SRH issues, but especially those pertaining to violence of any kind or sort, which is against every single religion that exists out there in the world that I know. For example, as an example, during premarital counseling in mosques, for example, we can encourage these leaders to openly discuss harmful and cultural norms, gender-based violence, and healthy SRH practices of couples on an individual, intimate level, not just preaching about the most basic and superficial things as a trainer. Be there as a safety net, be there as a point of contact. These religious leaders can let the couple know and assure them that whenever anything happens, they can have a question or a frustration, they can always come back to them. They can give them the trust. They will always be there to accurately answer their most important questions. And if they can't answer their questions because of the lack of knowledge, because of lack of experience, they will be able to direct them to the right resources. And what's important for us as organizations and institutions and leaders of this field, is to recognize that number one, engaging religious leaders to be mentors or trainers, and two, empowering them to be a safety net and a sole point of contact for these adolescents are two very different things, and they should result in very different frameworks for building and establishing interventions as nonprofit and academic organizations. These two approaches should definitely and naturally place very different emphasis points on how we can expect these religious leaders to step up and use their religious privileges to address our SRH issues, but at the same time also on how we can expect the youth and the people in the community to utilize these leaders as a resource at their convenience. It's also a comparison between whether it's one-directional teaching, one-directional throwing information into their faces, or bi-directional communication, and most importantly, empowerment of the community, starting from the most vulnerable youth populations that we have in our country. Let's just really make this about making a safety net instead of creating trainers. Let's make this about being their point of contact and a reliable person instead of just giving them fact sheets about knowledge. The second point is about changing the way we as in organizations and institutions are interacting with these religious leaders whenever we have a new intervention, and how we need help, immediate help from them actually, for better programming for the future. There's actually a lot of literature that shows religious involvement having really positive outcomes and impacts on so many aspects of life, in education, promoting more education, volunteering for your community, family well-being and happiness in the household, and of course, physical and emotional health as well. There's a lot of literature, evidence-based research that talks about the positive impacts of religious activities on these aspects of life. But also, on the other hand, it's also widely known that when it comes to reproductive health, the results speak differently and the nuances are quite different. It's quite clear that religious engagements and activities are often recognized to be negatively associated with encouraged SRH practices. And this to me is of course quite odd and surprising and should be for everyone else too. But just because I say that this is odd doesn't mean that I didn't expect this, because I completely understand and see how, according to our traditions and according to our histories, I can totally understand how and why religious traditions may not have been the fiercest advocate when it comes to sexual and reproductive health as a whole. But also think, why not in sexual and reproductive health? If they can impact these young people on so many other aspects of life, why not also on reproductive health as well? While we probably can't change the actual words and the content of the Bible or the Quran, we can definitely influence the way those messages are used to teach other people. We can also change how these messages are used to address which issues. But the problem is, we actually don't quite know how to do that. There's very limited literature on the influence of religious leaders on sexual activity or other risky behaviors in SRH among youth in Uganda. Our understandings of the role religious organizations can serve in SRH is quite limited, not because at least from my opinion, not because we haven't been engaging them enough, or not because we haven't been partnering up with them enough, but rather because there's not much evidence available on their actual impact and potential to create real change in the long term. And I think this is precisely where religious organizations need to really step up and kick in to help us help them, to eventually help the communities as a whole, to boost SRH and address our most urgent needs in the field of sexual and reproductive health. But of course, at the end of the day, nonprofit organizations involving religious people, nothing new about that. It's been around for decades. And from very early on, it was very quickly identified that religious leaders and religious organizations can be used to target men, for example, who are often not home for community-based education interventions and so on. So the virtue and the true value of working with those religious organizations have been long gone proved from decades ago. But I think because of the lack of feedback from the religious leaders' side, that leads to a shortage of literature for the specific field. This is precisely what I think makes organizations, whether they're new or whether they're very well established and famous, still base and program their religious interventions on unconscious assumptions. And I think we all agree, everyone here in this Zoom meeting, I think we all agree that the direct path, the best and easiest path to constructing an effective, but also like surprisingly sustainable program for the long run should always be basing our programs on clear-cut understandings of the current status quo of the situation. Even when we think that we know it all, even when we think, oh yes, we know how religious organizations function, we know how they can help with SRH topics. If we just ask ourselves the simple question of, do we really know everything about what they can do, what they can't do, what they need to put in, what they can't put in about these interventions? The answer can be so different. I mean, even for me personally, this is a personal story, and I'm leading a education intervention that heavily depends on VHTs under my organization called CCI that I introduced previously in the previous slide. And to prepare for that, as someone coming from a country with no system like VHTs, I spent more than a year, closer to 2 years, months and months of research, just learning and studying about the VHT system, what they can do, how other interventions and organizations have utilized them as a resource, and try to benchmark what they did in other countries and other organizations. But it really wasn't until I arrived here in Jinja, Uganda, maybe 10 days ago, sat on the same bench, shoulder to shoulder with these VHTs in Jinja, talked for hours after hours after hours over breakfast, tea, and lunch about what they're going through as VHTs, that I truly learned what their true potential is and what their drawbacks are. And all of those things were things that are not yet captured in literature and yet has a very big potential to affect the efficacy, the sustainability, the efficiency of any organization, any nonprofit intervention that bases on VHTs. I really also learned about what we as scholars and leaders still don't know about them, what the world doesn't know about VHTs, at least on a published level, which inspired a lot of new creative research questions as well. So I believe in this context, even drawing from my own personal experience working with VHTs, even when I thought that, oh, there's possibly no other literature that I could read. I interviewed so many people. I heard from them. I talked to them. I met with them. I probably know everything about them. Even after all those steps of preparing for my interaction with VHTs, the moment I came here and sat with them and talked for maybe 4 or 5 hours on their personal experiences, I really quickly realized I was just really arrogant in believing that I knew everything about them. I still don't know a lot about them because I need more time to sit on the same bench with them and talk more about what actually is for them to participate in this intervention. And I think it's the same for all these religious leaders in all these nonprofit interventions, community projects, and so on. I really think the missing key to building more effective programs to engage these religious leaders instead of just simply replicating and pumping out the same existing programs in other parts of the world. I think the real key is to talk with them, get some more effective, fruitful feedback that we just simply do not have any published out there in the world. That is the only way we'll be successfully avoiding just simply replicating all those other programs out there in the world that have one by one demonstrated that they may be effective for maybe a few years, but not enough to be long-term sustainable and not enough to change the villages and the communities at the most fundamental level. So I think even with religious organizations, religious leaders in MCH, SRH, whatever it is, I think everything should really start with a table and a long bench. Let's really sit on the same bench with our religious leaders we've been working together with and let them speak and share their most critical and sometimes even really painful feedback about how badly we did with certain interventions. Ask them frankly why things have not been working. I really think we still don't understand why these similar programs have been disappointing us in the past, one after the other, to make long-term impact. I think we really need to stop talking and pause and acting for a fat second, and do a little more hearing and listening from the religious leaders, because frankly, how many times have we been speaking with them on the same bench, on the same table, actually assessing their experiences of these interventions and what they are going through every time these new interventions, new programs, new organizations are introduced and then phased out. I don't know if there are any other religious members here today, religious leaders working in religious organizations especially, but please, if you are here for the sake of all of us, especially for the communities, please tell us about the most embarrassing stories, about the most embarrassing strategies, the worst programs you've ever seen, and why it was the worst for you, so that we can learn from those mistakes and not repeat them. I believe that is the only way, the most important thing that we have to prioritize and possibly ever even start with to even have a shot at properly grasping the drivers of success and failure and not really repeat what we did in the past and waste everyone's time and also resources. Those two main points are my major talking points of today. Number one, making sure we have a new framework of how we define the role, how we define the full scope of the potential that religious leaders have in addressing SRH issues. Let's stop unconsciously assigning them passive roles like, please be a trainer, please be a mentor. Let's make them more active in our communities by making them serve as a safety net for protection of the most vulnerable people of our communities, especially our young people of the communities. Number two was to set up a better feedback loop so that we can really build new programs and not just different programs under different names, but essentially the same in terms of lack of sustainability and failure of long-term impact. But before we end this talk, I want us to all take a step back and ask ourselves this one fundamental question. Let's ask ourselves, why is it called sexual and reproductive health and rights instead of just sexual and reproductive health, like almost every other health sector? And then along those lines, let's also think about what kind of strengths does the word rights in that phrase have attached? And what should that mean for us, all of us, as stakeholders and innovators, leaders of this field of medicine and healthcare? I personally believe the word rights is uniquely included in this phrase And it refers to the right to be safe, the right to be free, the right to know, and the right to act. And if we can just agree on all of that, then I think it should be especially clear to all of us that it may also be about the right to be helped. And of course, in our response, with our powers and our privileges, to use that to help protect their rights in reproductive and sexual health. So now let's begin. Now let's start this whole conversation by re-evaluating our tools of the framework we have working with these religious leaders, and also reestablish the way we understand their functions and their potentials, but in an evidence-based method. Thank you all so much for listening. I'll pass on the stage to our moderator, Mehdi.